Welcome to this edition of Fuel for Thought. I'm your host, Guido Vildozo, Associate Director of Consulting at S&P Global Mobility. In today's episode, we'll be diving into the 2024 U.S. presidential election, one of the most consequential elections in U.S. history, and which could definitely reshape the future of the U.S. automotive ecosystem. There are so many pivotal issues on the table, ranging from environmental regulation to trade policy and labor dynamics. The election outcome could have far reaching implications for the automakers, suppliers, and consumers alike. Joining us today are two experts who can help us dig into the potential scenarios at play here. Stephanie Brinley, Associate Director, AutoIntelligence, and Michael Robinet, Executive Director, Consulting at S&P Global Mobility. Welcome to both of you. Stephanie, let's lay some of the groundwork. Could you please provide insight into how the U.S. market is performing compared to other regions, particularly in light of recent economic conditions?
Good morning, and thanks for having me join you guys. 2024 hasn't seen the supply chain issues of past few years, but on a global level, we are seeing regional dynamics. Different areas have different interplay. We've got an uncertain macroeconomic environment and interest rate concerns across the world, and slower EV adoption has been an issue globally as well as here. For 2024, S&P Global Mobility expects the global light vehicle sales growth to be about 1.8%. And actually, we see the U.S. to be about the same. So we see the U.S. expected to grow about 1.8% in 2024 to about 15.9 million units. The U.S. continues to see increased volume and share for battery electric vehicles, but that pace has been slower than more optimistic projections.
Thank you for that insight, Steph. What are the main issues at stake in this election for the automotive industry, particularly in this climate that you're just referring to, where it seems like we're starting to move sideways?
Yeah, we look at a whole table full of issues, and the auto industry is expected to see issues regarding emissions regulations for 2028 model year and later. We see potential bumps in the road for the Inflation Reduction Act, which is the legislation that provides for tax credits on electric vehicles to consumers and fleet buyers, as well as manufacturing credits for EVs, batteries, and EV components in the US. The specter of tariffs or bans on mainland China sourced vehicles, as well as vehicle connectivity software and hardware. Potential challenges to California's exemption to set its own vehicle regulations can have a dramatic effect in terms of how automakers need to build and where they need to sell it. And the expected review and potential renegotiation of the free trade agreement between the US, Canada, and Mexico. Those really have a lot of interplay. With so many issues from a policy view, it creates an environment which affects what technology and future vehicles automakers and suppliers need to invest in as they work through creating products and services consumers want, but which are also compliant from a regulatory perspective.
Michael, let's turn to you as we dig into a few of these possibilities. You and I have spoken about this at length over the last few months. Let's dig into tariffs and national security measures, both being a bipartisan concern. How do you think these policies are going to shift depending on which party controls the White House and Congress within a few months?
Well, certainly, Guido, and thanks for the opportunity to chat on today's podcast. As Stephanie outlined, there's a lot going on, and it impacts the entire ecosystem, whether it be a vehicle manufacturer, supplier, dealer, financing, government entity, and obviously, in the end, the consumer as well. Certainly, there's a couple of different scenarios that could occur from a electoral perspective, whether we have a Republican or Democrat in the White House and what happens with respect to the Congress, the Senate, and the House of Representatives, and how it is made up and what kind of majorities all occur. So there's a lot of moving parts here. And I think any combination is going to have a slightly different, and in some cases, significantly different impact on the industry. But from the perspective that you're looking for in terms of national security, our view right now is that no matter which party gets in November and eventually forms a government in January, China is going to be front and center, whether there's going to be tariffs in place or other factors such as software origin and the like in terms of autonomous vehicles, critical minerals and where they're coming from and who's responsible for them. So it is going to have a substantial impact on the industry. It already is, but it's likely going to continue, and the industry is going to have to alter their strategies and their choices with respect to sourcing and products and propulsion systems as we go forward.
On that note, Michael, what would you anticipate, or how do you see some of this spilling over to the up and coming renegotiation for USMCA?
It is significant. I know Stephanie mentioned it as a real issue, and I would characterize it as right behind the IRA agreement and what the outcome of the IRA could be with the new government. The entire ecosystem, especially from a manufacturing and a distribution perspective, integrates Mexico. Mexico and Canada are very rationalized into the North American production system. So any changes with respect to taxation and or tariffs and or maybe labor criteria, whatever the case might be, are going to have pretty significant impacts on cost, sourcing, and other logistics dynamics to get parts and vehicles over the border. So virtually every vehicle manufacturer and many suppliers have facilities in Mexico and or Canada that are part of a rationalized system. So it's not easy to undo. And I think that is the critical issue that the industry is looking at.
It sounds, Michael, like the volatility and fluidity that we have seen over the last few months is likely going to extend into next year. Let's turn over to you, Steph. What about the Inflation Reduction Act? How might this change under Republican leadership, particularly regarding consumer incentives for electric vehicles?
The Inflation Reduction Act and its consumer tax incentives are super important in getting people to think about electric vehicles and how it turns into their monthly payment. We do expect that a Republican leadership of the White House would lead to efforts to reduce or end that consumer tax credit. But to make the change would require congressional approval because the Inflation Reduction Act in it is a law, not simply a policy. And if House or Senate are under Democratic leadership, getting the votes to make the changes will be more difficult. Congress hasn't moved really quickly to solve any number of things. So what that could mean is that the Republican leadership may be looking for change, but it might be more difficult to accomplish, which then puts the industry in a longer period of uncertainty, not quite knowing, and consumers not quite knowing what you can get, what you can count on and what you can't count on. So I think the uncertainty is part of the problem here, as well as looking to make changes to that.
Thank you, Stephanie. Michael, turning back to you, Uncle Sam has definitely kept the automotive industry up on their toes over the last few years, starting with CAFE, moving over to SAFE, and now back to CAFE legislation. How do you see environmental policies, particularly around vehicle emissions and safety regulations, differing between the two parties, both Republican and Democratic?
It's a wide open question because, again, it'll depend upon the severity or the majority that one party or the other is able to gain in either of the houses. Going forward, much of the legislation is going to have to be passed through Congress and not some sort of executive order. So that's going to become a bit more difficult going forward. But suffice to say that there are lots of different entities that are impacting emissions legislation. So whether it be the EPA or NHTSA, National Highway Transportation Safety Administration, whether it be those two and how they bring their policies together, and then add in the third rail, and that's California in terms of what they want to do. And right now our legislation is in unison with California, but given what may occur in November, that may be disjointed or split apart. And if it does get split apart, it's going to offer, much to what was said earlier about the stability of the market, that's going to offer some instability in a sense that the OEMs or the vehicle manufacturers are not going to have a clear view of what the legislation is. All these are major issues going forward. And so suffice to say, the trajectory of BEV adoption right now is problematic given the current legislation that's out there. So even if a Democratic White House were to form and maybe a split Congress, there could be an opportunity to even lower, or let's call it adjust, emissions legislation going forward. But there are a lot of balls in the air right now.
Thank you, Michael. I mean, a few takeaways right here. CARB, BEV adoption, USMCA. We've got our hurdles laid out. Steph, let's shift gears a little bit here. S&P Global Mobility believes a split Congress, regardless of who wins the White House, is the most likely election scenario. But the ultimate impact of any election outcome could take time to shake out? What are the key indicators that the industry stakeholders should watch for to gauge potential impact on the automotive landscape?
The industry stakeholders need to look and see if regulations change, and so they can determine the path for meeting those regulations. But at the same time, deciding the path to meet regulations takes time. So you can't just wait until it's settled to figure out some of your direction forward. So that's part of it, just figuring out what's going on with the regulations and how it applies to the tools that are already in that industry stakeholders toolkit, and determining a path to handle it if meeting the direct regulation isn't possible. Do you try to figure out if you can handle fines? Do you try to figure out if there's an offset you can work with? The transition to increasingly electrified vehicles is creating vehicles also that are more costly to build. And that's something that consumers are resisting to pay for a little bit right now. And those two things need to come together. And that's part of the reason that the consumer adoption has slowed a bit. And with willingness to pay being low below the cost to build, that's a gap that needs to be addressed. And I think that consumers and the slowdown on electric vehicle adoption also has a huge impact outside of the election. All of the things that are happening within the industry and within the nation to help move that adoption along simply take time. We've got consumer education, we've got infrastructure, we've got cost and price, and all of these things are being worked toward. So part of it is looking at these regulations and looking at what's happening with cost and looking what happened with willingness to pay, and having a little bit of patience to let everything, all the groundwork that's been laid to get consumers to move along a little bit better, take hold and take root. But changes to emissions regulations for IRA funding will also have a huge impact on the formula of what we're looking at. And we kind of look at a formula that says we need to look at the regulations, we need to look at the cost to build, and we need to look at consumer demand and figure out within that triangle where consumers are at and how to move them along.
Thank you, Steph. With that formula, Michael, coming into November, what would be your advice to both OEM suppliers and the entire automotive ecosystem as a whole as they're trying to navigate regulation, cost to build, labor costs, and so on and so forth? How would you tackle this situation if you were in their shoes?
Well, the whole idea of future strategy and planning for the future has really had to alter and shift over the last number of years. We've had so many calamities that have impacted the industry, whether it be COVID strikes, logistics issues, labor issues, China tariffs. All these factors impact how you source product, where you get it, how you build it, how it's delivered from a logistics perspective. And it just literally adds cost to the equation. So we're advising a lot of our clients to basically think about it from a scenario perspective. So you may have a base forecast that you would purchase from an S&P Global Mobility. You use that as a basis for your forecasting, but understanding what your possible other scenarios might be and how they might impact your strategy is probably as important, if not more. So for instance, if we have a full Republican sweep, that would be White House, House of Representatives, and the Senate, that may drive changes in USMCA. That may drive changes in the emissions legislation. It may drive changes in our tariff policy. It may drive other inflationary or non-inflationary issues. It depends on a whole number of factors. So if you as an organization believe that that is a probability maybe greater than 20-25%, maybe it's something that you need to look at. On the flip side, possibly what could be a full Democratic sweep due to USMCA renegotiation or the future of the IRA or all those other factors, and how would your company, you as a supplier or an OEM, have to react to that? So I think as clarity is gained in November, then the funnel closes a little bit, but even in some respects, scenario planning is becoming more and more important for the industry.
Thank you both, Stephanie and Michael, for sharing your insights on these key issues at stake with the U.S. election and the framework through which stakeholders should analyze risk and opportunities. Thank you also to everyone that is listening in to this episode. Please share this podcast link with colleagues and in your social media accounts whenever you can. Don't forget to follow us on LinkedIn at S&P Global Mobility and explore our products and offerings at spglobal.com/mobility. We'll be back for more Fuel for Thought next month. Have a great day.